for the invitation to participate. Thank you, Margaret and the GIS for the introductions and for organizing this webinar. I prepared a short presentation following what Taviano just mentioned. I hope you can see it. Okay. So yeah, with all these new words that Margaret alluded to at the beginning of the discussion. So let me start with a little bit of background. What are we talking about? What is called 21st century trade is trade done through basically global value chains. No, according to the World Bank World Development Report of 2019, I guess, about half, 50% of the world trade is currently conducted through GVCs. And the fact that GVCs have been around for a long time, but two features distinguish them from the usual trade. The first is that countries import to export and not only to consume. There is a seminal paper by Grossman and Rossi Hosberg called "The Rise of Offshoring." It's not about cloth and wine anymore, and this is basically the idea that actually firms do most of the trade, and transactions involve basically long-term firm-to-firm relationships and no longer anonymous spot market transaction. GVC trade expanded very rapidly between the 90s and 2010, the so-called long decade, and slowed down after the Great Recession. The expansion of GVC trade has to do with technological advances, reduction in costs of transportation, information and communication, and reduced trade barriers. So this allowed firms to extend production processes beyond national borders. In the development community, as Ottaviano knows well, trade within GVCs has been perceived as something very important because it intensifies the trade and development connections. Fragmented production, in principle, makes it possible for firms in developing countries to enter foreign markets at lower costs and not necessarily to establish the whole industry, but actually niche tasks, and so have access to larger markets. And in addition, it allows flows of ideas to flow across countries. The chart below shows how world trade to GDP increased over the 90s and early this century, the first decade of the century, and as I said, the slowdown of the expansion of trade in that period. And actually, this increase in trade basically what resulted in the fact that 2/3 of the manufacturing sector, as noted by Baldwin and Freeman in 2021, 2/3 of the world manufacturing was in industrialized countries, or basically in the G7 countries, and now it's less than half, with the corresponding shares have gained by China. So this slide shows basically what we are talking about, what 21st century trade is. It's a slide by my ex-colleagues at the IDB, in which most of the activity was intra-factory and within one country, and with the ICT revolution, it became international. So the flows of goods, ideas, knowledge, and investment in training flow from industrialized countries to also developing economies. Well, this is the story, this is the background. What are we talking about now is the recent trends and shocks. Basically, the recent political, health, environmental, and economic disruptions as Ottaviano was saying, have fueled concerns about the current global value chain trade interdependence and triggered a narrative that emphasizes risks and vulnerabilities of these international networks of production. And we can cite at least 4 events that are important. One is the Tohoku earthquake of back to 10 years ago in 2011 in Japan, also referred to as the Fukushima earthquake. Tohoku is the largest area. The US-China trade war that was particularly acute starting in 2017-18. The COVID pandemic more recently, with the impact on the supply chains, and even more recent, the Russia war on Ukraine. These shocks, we are not talking only about shocks, we are also talking about trends that are behind the slowdown that we saw. Basically, what one can explain this new trade, the 21st century trade, the global value chains, as an issue of labor arbitrage, no? With the reduction in technological costs, with the costs of trade, costs of technology, costs of information, allowed firms to actually produce high quality goods with lower wages that could be found in developing countries. This labor arbitrage somehow changed through time more recently with, for instance, the increase in wages or the unit labor costs in China, which reduced the possibilities of labor arbitrage, leading to the start of the discussion about relocation of firms and jobs. In addition, there are some technological trends, and we can refer to robotization, to robots, that one can think that this advantage of finding lower wages elsewhere is being replaced by the view that, well, we can do it with robots. So it would favor onshoring or reshoring, coming back, bringing back the jobs to industrialized countries. But if we focus on the disruptions, they are more recent, and or at least the intensification of these disruptions is more recent, and suggest and generated several policy proposals stressing that GVCs should be perhaps shorter, perhaps more domestic, more regional. This is the idea of nearshoring, no? Doing it with your neighbors, and more recently, even this idea of friendshoring. You should do it only with your friends, which poses some interesting questions, and or more diversified. No, I mean, GVCs should look for more diversification. This is an important point. I will come back to it. And accordingly, governments, in particular in industrialized countries, have been announcing plans to reassess their dependence to external suppliers. The US has been talking about this. Ottaviano just mentioned his participation in a conference and how the bipartisan mood in the US about dependence, in particular to China. But in Europe is no different, and even in some middle-income economies, as we know. So this is basically what was generated. And one interesting statistic, again, my colleagues at the IDB, ex-colleagues at the IDB noticed this, the citation of these terms, nearshoring and reshoring, in English language books jumped in recent years. They didn't exist a few years back. I didn't include friendshoring because friendshoring is recent, came up, I think, a couple of months ago or so, but there are already some papers on it. So, and what is the evidence so far? What happened in terms of, nearshoring, reshoring? The evidence is so far is one of limited changes, no? Global firms apparently are cautious on revising their current location plans. And as Ottaviano mentioned, and he wrote recently about it, trade has been showing very strong resistance, no? And And not only trade, here I added a rapid calculation on trade by categories of goods. And what you see is that what is called global value chain trade, which is the trade in intermediate goods, the trade between firms, has been rising fast. No, I mean the two categories that are growing faster are raw materials because of prices, the price increases of commodities, and the second is intermediate goods. So far trade has been doing well. We don't know if this will continue, how long, but anyway. And anecdotal evidence also suggests that firms are not willing to change dramatically location, and we can try to think a little bit what could be the factors behind these decisions. One possibility is that firms are waiting the best moment to relocate plants. This could happen, but could localization decisions be influenced by a more complex set of conditions? I think definitely yes. The answer for this latter question is yes. The discussion has been framed around resilience versus robustness. No, resilience understood as ability to respond to a disruption in a cost-effective way, and robustness ability to maintain operations when facing a shock. And so robustness calls for redundancy, for having spare or clients that or firms that could replace the ones that you discussed, while resilience thinks about calls for perhaps a little bit more efficiency. No, so the key trade-off here involves diversification of risks versus lower costs and higher quality. And the truth is that the way the complexity of this value chains have evolved require more and more niche expertise, no? And so it requires more specialization rather than diversification. This is true. The second is this discussion about external versus domestic shocks, and Ottaviano and co-authors Justin Lin and Zhang wrote recently about this, and Raghuram Rajan also wrote recently that, you know, bringing the supply chains to your economy doesn't mean that you will have less shocks. You will face a different nature, no, shocks of the different natures, domestic shocks, and Rajan just reminded us that the crisis in the U.S. I was living in the U.S. until recently, and Ottaviano lives there. The crisis of the so-called baby formula has nothing to do with international supply chains. It's actually, you know, the baby formulas disappears from supermarkets in different areas of the country, and it's basically a domestic supply chain. So yeah, you face different shocks, right? The idea basically is that these are equilibrium outcomes, no, that take into account agglomeration and dispersion forces, and somehow focus on, as I said, niche expertise. And there is an interesting line of research from some colleagues, some of them ex-colleagues at the World Bank, like Daria Taglioni, and professors at the MIT, like Sturgeon, and also the other authors, Stan and Dallas, which points to mass modularity in a growing number of industries. So industries are really being characterized by several layers of highly specialized inputs done by different firms. So the possibility to replace current suppliers is much more difficult because of this complexity, because of the capital investment and deep capabilities that one needs. It's not that easy to take the firms out of China, say to mention an example, and move it to, I don't know, to any other country in the world. So I think this is very important, and perhaps we are thinking too much, and this is a point made by these authors, that we are taking this analogy of value chain too far. No, it's a value chain. You identified where's the bottleneck, and you say, well, we have to fix it here. But actually, it's it's a different ball game in the sense that you have different firms and different groups of firms working together, and makes it much more difficult to change that. So this is some of the thinking that I think is relevant for the discussion about these topics. Let me say a few words very rapidly about Latin America, since Latin America, well, both Otaviano and I come from Latin America. But nearshoring is a term often associated to Latin America. No, I mean, nearshoring as the idea of a true factory America emerging as a consequence of the geopolitical tensions and moving a lot of firms from Asia to the US. At the IDB, this has been discussed a lot, and there are there are competing views here. I mean, some people more skeptical about this possibility, some others more optimistic. But when you look at the numbers, you see, and this is an interesting exercise that ex-colleagues of mine made. So this is what happened after the war, not the war, the real war, the trade war, no? The rise in the hike in tariffs in 2017. And these are the composition of US imports. And what you see is that Chinese, the inner red numbers are pre tariff hike, no, and the outer ones are the more recent. And what you see, for instance, imports from the US. From China, it reduced from 21.4 to 18.3. Not that much, but still 3 points of percentage. And who actually gained something? It was not Latin America. Look at Latin America here. You can see Mexico, which remained basically stable, and the other countries in LAC, actually in Latin America, reduced their participation. So who actually gained was the other Asian countries. So it moved from China to other Asian countries. The rest remained basically, of course, I'm not looking at, this is not a full econometric exercise controlling for other variables, but anyway, it gives you an idea that perhaps, and this is related basically to the fact, and this is what we have been discussing, is that the composition of export from Latin America, perhaps with the exception of Mexico, is really based on, it doesn't compete with China. That no, it's not a composition of, and there are the issues, the long-term structural weaknesses of education infrastructure institutions that require a lot of attention and that are long-term trends. So let's talk basically about policy and some final conjectures. We are basically with conjectures here, no? I mean, the future is hard to predict, as someone once said. But we have seen very limited changes. But the question is, will the persistence and, more importantly, the intensification of geopolitical tensions increase the likelihood of a reshape of GVCs? And secondly, will policy make a difference? I think that one point that I think is important, and Martin Wolf reminded us at the FT last week, wars are transformative, no? I mean, and here, war is different from, plain war is different from trade war or Cold War or a war with an objective. So having said that, what we are seeing is that government announced plans, but it's hard to think, and Baldwin and Freeman do make this point, that about mass subsidies done to different areas or different sectors, no? Of the economy. I think that there are clear limits to industrial policy, subsidies and protection, and the fiscal limits. And Canuto, in his paper with Justin Lin and Zhang, mentioned it very clearly. So the most reasonable outcome to think about the future is that we will still see basically countries looking for horizontalish policies, no, aiming at minimizing trade and investment costs, which is a long-term policy, and very specific and target to very specific sectors. Semiconductors was one of them, and perhaps you can think of others. But still, very limited group of sectors that could be favored by subsidies from developed countries to bring back and perhaps by middle income economies to bring back the jobs from the other parts of the world. So this is it. I hope this helps frame the discussion. But over to you, Otaviano.